She stood before 400 employees and told him he didn't belong at the top. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just closed his notebook, looked her in the eye, and said 7 words that nobody in that room understood, until it was far too late. What she didn't know was that the quiet man she had just humiliated in front of the entire company already owned a piece of it. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by someone who thought they held all the power, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we share on this channel have a way of finding the people who need them most. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next inside Novacore Technologies is something nobody saw coming. The rain had been falling since before sunrise. It came down in long, diagonal sheets across the Chicago skyline, the kind of October rain that doesn't bother announcing itself. It just arrives and stays, soaking through coat collars, pooling in cracked sidewalks, turning the city into something gray and muted and a little defeated looking. Commuters hunched their shoulders and walked faster. Taxis honked at nothing. The coffee carts on Michigan Avenue were doing record business. Ryan Ashford stood at the crosswalk on West Monroe Street and waited for the light to change. He was holding an umbrella, a cheap one, the collapsible kind with a bent spoke that made it lean slightly to the left, no matter how you gripped it, and a worn leather folder tucked under his right arm. He was 32 years old, though people who didn't know him often guessed older, maybe mid-30s, because there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested a man who had been tired for a long time and had simply made peace with it. He wasn't wearing anything remarkable. Dark slacks, a white dress shirt that had been ironed carefully, but was starting to show a faint fraying at the left cuff, and a charcoal gray jacket that had seen 4 Chicago winters. His shoes were polished. That part mattered to him. His father had once told him that you could tell everything about a man's discipline by looking at his shoes, and even on the worst mornings, Ryan Ashford polished his shoes. This was one of those mornings. He had been up since 5:15. His daughter, Lily, had climbed into his bed somewhere around 2 in the morning. She did that sometimes, still, even at 7 years old, ever since her mother had left 3 years ago, without much of an explanation and even less of a goodbye. Lily hadn't said a word about the nightmares in a long time, but Ryan could always tell when they came back because she'd show up in his doorway holding her stuffed elephant, Mr. Trunks, and she'd stand there waiting to be invited in without actually asking. He always pulled back the blanket without saying anything. That was their arrangement. She'd finally fallen back asleep around 4. He'd watched the ceiling for a while after that, going over numbers, going over timelines, going over the specific words he planned to say in approximately 3 hours when he stood in front of Victoria Langley and the rest of the senior leadership team. He had not slept again. The light changed. Ryan crossed the street. Novacore Technologies occupied the top 14 floors of a glass tower on South Wacker Drive, one of those buildings that looks impressive from the outside and vaguely oppressive from the inside, all open floor plans and exposed ductwork and motivational phrases stenciled onto the walls in oversized sans serif fonts. Innovation is courage. Lead boldly. The future belongs to the daring. Ryan had walked past those phrases every day for 3 years and never once said anything about them. He had his opinions. He kept them to himself. He badged in at the lobby security desk, nodded to the overnight guard, Marcus, a big man in his late 50s who always had a thermos of coffee and always asked about Lily, and took the elevator to the 9th floor, where the project management division lived. The office was already running when he arrived, which wasn't unusual. The 9th floor had been running at a barely controlled simmer for the better part of 3 months, ever since the Meridian account had come unglued and Ryan had been quietly handed the wreckage to sort through. He'd sorted through it. That was what he did. "Morning," said Dana Cho, not looking up from her monitor. Dana was Ryan's closest colleague, project coordinator, 35, perpetually stressed in a way that somehow made her more efficient, not less. She had a habit of delivering important information while appearing to pay attention to something else entirely. Hendricks from the Boston office called again. He wants a status update on the Q4 rollout before the all-hands. I sent him one yesterday afternoon. He says he didn't get it. He got it. He just doesn't like the numbers. Dana finally looked up. She had dark circles under her eyes and a coffee cup that appeared to be her third of the morning. "Ryan, today's the day, right? The announcement?" He set his leather folder on his desk. That's what the memo said. Are you, I mean, she lowered her voice even though they were alone in the immediate area. Are you nervous? Ryan considered the question genuinely. No, he said after a moment. She stared at him. You've been here 3 years. You pulled the Meridian account back from the cliff. You rebuilt the entire Eastern Project Division workflow from scratch. You've been covering for executives twice your level without getting credit for any of it. And today they're announcing the Regional Executive Director position. And you're not nervous? Being nervous won't change what's already been decided. That's not a comforting answer, Ryan. He sat down and opened his folder. I know, but it's an honest one. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main atrium on the 12th floor. Novacor held these events with a kind of theatrical seriousness that Ryan had always found slightly exhausting. The way the AV team set up the stage lighting, the way the branded backdrop appeared behind the podium as if a presidential debate were about to begin. The way employees filed in and arranged themselves with the careful social calculus of people who were simultaneously pretending not to care about hierarchy while being exquisitely aware of exactly where everyone stood within it. Ryan stood near the back. This was intentional. He was almost always near the back at these things. It wasn't shyness. He wasn't particularly shy. It was more that he'd learned early on that the back of a room gave you the best angle on what was actually happening. You could see the front and the middle. You could see who whispered to whom. You could see where people's eyes went when they were nervous or uncertain. The back of the room was information-rich in ways the front never was. He counted roughly 400 employees in the atrium. That was most of the Chicago division plus a handful of faces he recognized from the East Coast leadership team who had come in overnight. The presence of the East Coast people was interesting. He filed that away. Victoria Langley walked onto the stage at exactly 10:02, and the room shifted. That was the only word for it. Shifted. Not all in one direction, more like a collective reorientation, the way a school of fish moves when something large enters the water nearby. People straightened up. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the people who privately complained about her, and there were many, across many floors, stopped what they were doing when she walked into a room. Victoria Langley was 30 years old, which was still remarkable enough that people mentioned it regularly, though she had made clear on multiple occasions that she found it condescending when they did. She had taken over Novacor from its failing founders at 27, using a combination of family capital, personal leverage, and what several board members had described in various interviews as an almost unnerving instinct for pressure. She was brilliant in ways that were obvious and difficult in ways that were less obvious until you had worked for her for a while, at which point they became extremely obvious. She was also, Ryan had concluded after careful observation over 3 years, someone who had been told she was exceptional for so long that she had stopped being able to accurately distinguish between decisions that were genuinely excellent and decisions that were simply hers. That was a dangerous gap to live in. He knew that from experience. She wore a fitted navy blazer and her dark hair pulled back, and she moved across the stage with the deliberate ease of someone who had long since stopped being nervous in front of audiences. She gripped the podium with one hand, looked out at the room, and smiled the smile that Ryan had watched her deploy on dozens of occasions, the one that was warm enough to seem genuine and controlled enough to be a tool. "Good morning, Novacor." The room answered back in the scattered, slightly self-conscious way rooms full of professionals always do. "I want to start today by talking about what this company is actually for." She paused, and the pause was practiced. "We're not here to maintain. We're not here to coast on the infrastructure that's already been built. We are here to lead. And leadership, real leadership, requires a very specific kind of person. Someone who doesn't just understand the business. Someone who understands the vision." Ryan watched the faces in front of him while she talked. He could see Dana about 15 feet to his left, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. He could see Tom Bridger, head of the Eastern Operations, standing near the stage with his hands clasped behind his back and a small, satisfied angle to his chin that Ryan had been observing for about 6 weeks. That angle told him everything he needed to know about where this announcement was going before Victoria said another word. He had known for a while, actually. He just hadn't let himself fully commit to knowing it, the way you sometimes don't fully commit to knowing a diagnosis until the doctor says it out loud. The regional executive director position is the most important role I will fill this year, Victoria continued. This person will oversee our 5 regional divisions, interface directly with our largest client portfolio, and serve as the operational backbone of everything we're trying to build over the next 3 years. Another pause. She was very good at pauses. I don't make decisions like this lightly. I make them based on vision alignment, on character, and on the confidence I have in someone's ability to represent what Novacor truly stands for. She turned slightly to her left. Tom Bridger has been a cornerstone of this company's East Coast growth for the past 4 years. He is a leader who understands our values and our direction. Effective Monday, Tom Bridger will serve as Regional Executive Director. There was applause, the kind that starts in one section and moves through a crowd in a wave, genuine in some places, reflexive in others, and in a few specific corners, notably absent. Ryan didn't move. He stood where he was and listened to the applause and looked at the water stain on the far wall that he had been meaning to submit a maintenance request about for the better part of 2 months. He breathed slowly through his nose. Tom Bridger, who had been on a golf course in Scottsdale 3 weekends ago with Victoria's brother-in-law, who had missed the Meridian crisis entirely because he'd been at a leadership conference that Ryan had covered for him without being asked to, who had submitted a Q3 report in August that contained 3 separate errors in the financial projections, errors Ryan had quietly corrected before the document reached the board, and received not so much as a thank you. Tom Bridger. Right. Ryan felt something move through him. Not rage. He had a complicated relationship with rage, always had. Something to do with growing up in a house where his father's anger had filled every room until there was no air left for anyone else. And he had made a very early decision to be a different kind of man in that particular way. Not rage, then. More like a settling. The kind of quiet that happens when a long-standing uncertainty is finally resolved into certainty, even when the certainty is disappointing. He already knew what he was going to do. He had known for several weeks, if he was honest. He had just needed this moment to make it official. He began moving toward the front of the room. I didn't push through the crowd. He moved through the gaps, the way people do when they're not in a hurry and not trying to be noticed and somehow end up getting where they're going anyway. A few people saw him and moved instinctively, the way people do around someone who carries themselves with genuine purpose, even quiet purpose. He was halfway to the stage when Victoria saw him. He could see it. The moment she registered that he was moving through the crowd toward her, the fractional adjustment in her expression. Not quite concern. More like the particular alertness of someone who has grown accustomed to being in control of rooms and has just noticed a variable they hadn't accounted for. He stopped about 12 feet from the edge of the stage. The applause had died down. Tom Bridger was shaking hands with people near the podium. The AV team was doing something with a cable. "Ms. Langley," Ryan said. Not loudly, but clearly. She looked at him from the stage. The angle was awkward. She was elevated, he was not, and something in her expression shifted into a mode he recognized from previous encounters. The rhetorical positioning mode, the mode where she was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Mr. Ashford," her voice carried well. "Do you have something you'd like to add?" The room went quieter. People who had been in the process of leaving stopped leaving. Ryan kept his voice even. "I'd just like to understand the criteria," he said, "for the position. I think several people here would." A beat. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "That's a conversation for a different setting." "With respect," Ryan said, "we've had that conversation in several different settings over the past year. I was told the decision would be based on project outcomes, division performance, and documented results." He held up the leather folder slightly. Not dramatically, just indicating it existed. "I have 3 years of documented results. The Meridian recovery. The Eastern workflow restructure, the Portland contract that went through in July. I'm well aware of your work, Ryan." "Then help me understand," he said, and there was no hostility in it, just a genuine and slightly unsettling calm. "Because the results support a different decision." Victoria looked at him for a moment. The room had gone very quiet. Ryan could hear the rain against the high atrium windows. He could see Dana in his peripheral vision, very still, not breathing in any obvious way. Victoria stepped slightly closer to the edge of the stage. When she spoke, her voice had a quality he had heard her use before with people she had decided were a problem. Not cruel exactly, but edged with something that was meant to close a door. Ryan, I appreciate your passion, truly. But leadership isn't just about numbers. It's about vision. It's about knowing how to carry yourself in this company's culture. A slight pause. And sometimes it's about knowing your place. Knowing your place. The words landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. The impact was brief, and the ripple lasted considerably longer. Ryan could feel the collective discomfort around him, the way people shifted their weight, looked at the floor, looked at their phones, looked anywhere except at the two people at the center of this. He looked at Victoria Langley. She was 30 years old and brilliant, and she had just made an error so fundamental that she wouldn't understand the size of it for quite some time. He felt something very close to sadness, actually. Not for himself. For what she still hadn't learned to see. He closed the leather folder, slowly and deliberately. The sound of it was small in the large room, but somehow audible. Then perhaps, he said, his voice entirely steady, it's time you prepare for your own decision. He held her gaze for exactly one more second, not long enough to be theatrical, long enough to be real. And then he turned and walked away from the stage, toward the back of the atrium, toward the elevator bank, toward the exit. The room did not erupt. There was no dramatic collective gasp, no cinematic swell of music. What happened was stranger and in some ways more powerful than that. What happened was silence. The particular kind that descends when 400 people have just witnessed something they can't immediately categorize, something that lands in the chest before it lands in the mind. Ryan walked through that silence like it was ordinary air. What? He took the elevator to the 9th floor, went directly to his desk, and sat down. Dana appeared beside him approximately 45 seconds later, which had to be some kind of personal best even for her. What? She said. It wasn't really a question. Ryan opened his laptop. I need to finish the Bridger handoff notes for the Eastern Division before end of day. He's going to need the Hendricks account background or he'll miss the first client call. Ryan, the Portland follow-up also needs to go out. I'll handle that before I leave. Ryan. He looked up. Dana was staring at him with an expression he could only describe as controlled bewilderment, like someone trying very hard not to panic on an airplane because they knew panicking wouldn't help anything, but the situation was not improving. What did that mean? She said. What did you mean, prepare for your own decision? Exactly what it sounded like. That's not clarifying. She just humiliated you in front of the whole company, in front of 400 people. She told you to know your place, Ryan, and you just walked away. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not evasively, genuinely thinking about how much to say and what words were the right ones. He picked up his pen and turned it in his fingers once, a habit. Because everything I needed to communicate was already communicated, he said, and because some conversations aren't meant to happen in atriums. Dana looked at him for a long beat. You know something, she said slowly. You know something the rest of us don't. He didn't answer that directly. Can you pull up the Meridian post-project file? He said instead. The full version with the original communication logs. I need to make sure the documentation is complete before end of week. She stared at him another moment, then turned to her computer with the expression of someone who has decided to table a question because they sense the answer coming on its own. Ryan worked until 6:15. He always worked until close to 6, regardless of what the official hours were, because there was always something that needed finishing, and because staying late had always been easier than going home to a quiet apartment and a 7-year-old who asked questions he didn't always have answers to. He stopped at the grocery store on the way home. He bought pasta, Lily's current preferred food, a conviction she held with the intensity only small children can sustain, and a jar of the marinara sauce she liked, and a bunch of bananas, and a box of the apple juice boxes she took to school. The rain had stopped. The sidewalks were still wet, reflecting the streetlights in long, broken shapes. He walked the 4 blocks from the parking structure to his building carrying a grocery bag in each hand and his leather folder under his arm, and he thought about what came next. Not with anxiety, just clearly, the way he approached most things. One step, then the next step, then the step after that. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He shifted a bag to check it. It was a calendar notification. Emergency board meeting request. Submitted. Confirmation pending. He read it, then put the phone back in his pocket. Lily would want to play cards after dinner. She had been on a go-fish kick for 3 weeks and showed no signs of stopping. He was going to lose, as he usually did, because she cheated with the cheerful confidence of someone who had not yet decided that cheating was actually cheating, and he was never quite sure how to address that without making the game feel less fun than it was. He'd figure it out. He took the elevator to the 8th floor, unlocked his apartment door, and heard her before he saw her. "Daddy, Mr. Trunks learned a new trick." The grocery bags went on the kitchen counter. He knelt down in the hallway as Lily came barreling toward him in socked feet on the hardwood floor, barely slowing down before she hit him, and he caught her the way he always did. Both arms, easy, solid. She smelled like crayon wax and the lavender shampoo he bought her and like herself, that specific smell that was entirely her, that he couldn't have described to anyone but would have recognized in any room on earth. "What trick?" he said into the top of her head. "He can sit now, like a dog." "Elephants don't usually sit like dogs. Mr. Trunks is special." "He is," Ryan agreed. He held on for a moment longer than necessary. She allowed it, which meant she'd had a good day. When the days weren't good, she pulled back faster, impatient to tell him why. The fact that she was leaning into him now was data. Good. He stood up and started unpacking groceries. "Pasta okay for dinner? With the red sauce? Is there another kind?" She thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Yes," she said, "but the red sauce is the best kind." "Then red sauce it is." He put the water on to boil. In the leather folder on the counter, neatly organized and cross-referenced and absolutely complete, were 3 years of documentation that told a very specific and very detailed story about a company and the way it was being run. Every failed promotion, every favoritism decision, every meeting where the decision had already been made before the meeting began. Every project that succeeded because of one quiet man who never put his name on anything he'd fixed. The water started to simmer. Lily climbed onto the kitchen stool and positioned Mr. Trunks facing the stove. "He wants to watch," she explained. "Good seat," Ryan said. He stirred the pasta in. In 6 days, there would be a board meeting that would change the shape of a company. Victoria Langley would walk into that room with absolute confidence and walk out of it with nothing she had assumed was solid, but right now there was pasta and a stuffed elephant and a 7-year-old who was, by all observable evidence, doing okay. That was enough. That was, in the actual accounting of things, more than enough. Ryan Ashford turned down the heat and waited. The morning after the all-hands meeting, Novacore Technologies felt different. Not dramatically different. Nothing had collapsed overnight. No alarms were sounding. The coffee machines on every floor were still running, and the motivational phrases were still stenciled on the walls in their oversized fonts. But there was a quality to the air in the building on Tuesday morning that hadn't been there on Monday. Something slightly off balance, like a table with one leg fractionally shorter than the others. You could ignore it if you wanted to, but once you felt it, you couldn't unfeel it. People talked, was the thing. They always talked. That was the constant of every office Ryan had ever worked in. But they talked differently now. Quieter in certain clusters, more animated in others. He noticed it when he badged through the lobby. He noticed it in the elevator, where 2 people stopped speaking mid-sentence when the doors opened and he stepped in, then resumed in lower voices when he looked at his phone. He noticed it at the coffee station on 9, where a junior analyst named Kevin started to say something, caught himself, and turned the almost comment into a question about whether the dark roast was fresh. It was. Ryan told him so. Kevin thanked him and left faster than he needed to. Dana was already at her desk when he arrived, which meant she'd been there for at least an hour, which meant she hadn't slept particularly well. She had the look of someone who had spent the night conducting a very thorough internal debate and had arrived at work still not fully resolved. She waited until he sat down and opened his laptop before she said anything. "People are talking about you." "I know. Not just here. The East Coast team is... Apparently there's a thread in the internal messaging system." There usually is after something like that. Dana put her coffee down with a small, precise motion that he recognized as her version of emphasis. "Ryan, she told you to know your place in front of the whole company, and the only thing you said back was, whatever that was, 7 words, and then you left, and now nobody knows what to make of it." "What are they saying?" "Some people think you snapped, like finally hit your limit snapped. Some people think you have a job offer somewhere and you just don't care anymore. A few people..." She hesitated. A few people think you were threatening her, that you know something. He didn't respond immediately. He pulled up his email, which had 43 new messages in it since 6:15 the previous evening, scanned the subject lines, and began working through them in order of actual importance, which was not the same as the order in which people had marked them urgent. "What do you think?" he said, without looking up. Dana was quiet long enough that he did look up. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not suspicion, not quite. Something more like the expression you wear when you're looking at a puzzle you've had sitting on your kitchen table for 6 months and you've just noticed a piece fitting somewhere you never tried. "I think," she said carefully, "that you don't do things without reasons. And I think whatever reason you had for walking away yesterday, the way you walked away, it was a very different kind of reason than the ones people are guessing at." Ryan held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his screen. "The Portland Quarterly debrief needs to go out this morning. Can you pull the Q3 numbers from the shared drive?" She picked up her coffee. "Already in your inbox," she said. "Sent it at 7:45. "Thank you." "You're welcome." A beat. "I hate that I don't know what's happening." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." It was a genuine apology, not a deflection. She heard the difference. She didn't push further. Tom Bridger arrived on the 9th floor at 10:23, which was late by any reasonable standard, but which he managed to make feel like a calculated entrance. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of even tan that came from extended time at outdoor resorts rather than actual outdoor labor. And he wore his new status with the cheerful confidence of someone who had wanted this for a long time and was still in the warm first hours of having it. He stopped at Ryan's desk. Ryan looked up. "Hey, buddy." Tom had always called him Buddy. Ryan had always disliked it. "Hell of a morning yesterday, huh?" "It was a lot to process," Ryan said. Tom leaned against the desk partition with the ease of someone making himself at home in a space he now considered part of his domain. "Look, I know it wasn't the outcome you were hoping for. For what it's worth, I think you do great work, really great work. The stuff you did on Meridian, genuinely impressive." "Thank you." "I'm going to need your help with the transition. You know the Eastern Division files better than anyone. Honestly, I don't think anyone else even knows where half that documentation lives." "I've been putting together handoff notes," Ryan said. "I'll have them to you by Thursday." Tom visibly relaxed. This was apparently better news than he'd expected. That's great. That's really helpful, Ryan. And listen, I know things felt a little tense yesterday, but I want you to know my door's always open. We're a team, right?" "Right," Ryan said. Tom pointed at him with a pair of finger guns, an actual pair of finger guns deployed without irony, and pushed off the partition. "Thursday. Perfect. You're a good man, Ashford." He walked away in the direction of the corner office that had apparently already been designated as his. Dana materialized at Ryan's shoulder approximately 4 seconds after Tom's back was turned. "Did he just finger gun you?" she said. "He did. While asking you to do half his job for him." "He's going to need a lot of help," Ryan said, in the tone of someone making a neutral observation about weather patterns. "The Hendricks account alone has about 200 pages of background that aren't organized in any way that makes intuitive sense. Someone spent 3 years building a system in their head rather than on paper." "Someone being you." "Being me, yes." She looked at him steadily. "Ryan, are you actually going to help him?" He saved the document he'd been working on, closed the laptop slightly, and looked at her directly. "I'm going to give him everything he needs to do the job well," he said. "That's what the company needs. That's not the same as staying to watch him do it." The sentence sat in the air between them. Dana opened her mouth, closed it, and looked away first. What happened over the following 18 days was not the dramatic implosion that gossip predicts and reality rarely delivers. It was slower than that, and in some ways worse. The way a slow leak is worse than a burst pipe, because at least with a burst pipe, everyone immediately knows there's a problem. It started with Hendricks. Martin Hendricks was a senior partner at a consulting firm in Boston that contributed approximately $4.7 million annually to Novacore's revenue, a relationship Ryan had personally maintained for 2.5 years through a combination of meticulous follow-through, a genuine understanding of what the man actually needed, as opposed to what he said he needed, and the patience to return phone calls within the same business day, regardless of what else was happening. Hendricks was not an easy client. He was particular, slightly paranoid, prone to calling at inconvenient hours with concerns that were either minor or catastrophic and could not always be immediately distinguished. Tom Bridger returned his first post-transition call 26 hours after it came in. Ryan found out through Dana, who found out through the administrative assistant on 11, who had overheard the resulting conversation because Bridger had not fully closed his office door. He called it a courtesy delay, Dana reported. Hendricks apparently used the phrase, rethinking our relationship. Ryan set down his pen. What exactly did Bridger say to him? Something about new energy and fresh perspective on the account. He apparently also got 2 of the project milestones wrong. Which ones? The February deliverable and the Phase 3 timeline. Ryan was quiet for a moment. The February deliverable and the Phase 3 timeline were the 2 pieces of the Hendricks account that required the most contextual background to discuss accurately. Background that was sitting in the handoff notes he had delivered to Tom on Thursday, clearly labeled, with a summary page at the front specifically because he had anticipated exactly this kind of error. The notes had apparently not been read. Is Hendricks actually going to leave? He said. I don't know. He's called twice since yesterday. To Bridger? To the main account line, which routes to Bridger's assistant now. She paused. He's also sent 2 emails to your address. Ryan pulled up his email. There they were, both marked urgent, both with the tight, clipped subject lines of a man who was upset and trying to remain professional about it. He read them carefully. Then he closed the email. I'll draft a response and copy Tom, he said. That's very generous of you, Ryan, given the circumstances. It's not generous, he said. It's the right thing to do for the account. And when this gets documented as the first major client concern under the new leadership structure, I want it documented correctly. She looked at him with an expression that hovered between admiration and something that might have been pity. You think of everything, she said quietly. Not everything, he said, but most things. The Hendricks situation was one thread. There were others. The Portland contract, which Ryan had shepherded through 9 months of negotiation, had a 30-day implementation window that required daily coordination across 3 departments. Tom took over the coordination meetings and immediately restructured them from daily check-ins to twice-weekly summaries. A decision that made sense in theory and in practice meant that small problems festered for 3 to 4 days before anyone caught them. The first small problem that festered became a medium problem by the time it surfaced. The medium problem cost $43,000 to resolve and pushed the implementation window by 11 days. Ryan was not in those meetings anymore. He had removed himself quietly, partly because it was no longer his role, and partly because watching Tom Bridger make predictable errors in real time was an exercise in patience that he wasn't sure served anyone. He knew about the $43,000 because Dana told him, and Dana knew because the project coordinator on the Portland account had called her in quiet desperation on a Wednesday afternoon, asking if she thought Ryan would be willing to consult informally. What did you tell her? Ryan asked. I told her I'd ask you, Dana said, and I'm asking you. Tell her I'm not in a position to step back into that account directly, but she can call me if she has a specific question she can't find an answer to in the documentation. She's going to read that as a yes. She can read it however she needs to. The call came at 4:30 that afternoon. It lasted 11 minutes. Ryan answered 3 questions, referred her to 2 specific sections of documentation that she hadn't found, and declined to comment on anything related to the current leadership decisions. She thanked him 6 times in those 11 minutes. He counted, not because he was keeping score, but because it told him something about how bad things had gotten in that room. The thing about systems, Ryan had learned over years of building and rebuilding them, was that they didn't announce their own fragility. They held and held and held, and then they didn't. And the moment they stopped holding, the people inside them discovered very quickly how much they had been relying on the scaffolding they'd never seen. He had spent 3 years building scaffolding at Novacor. Not because he'd planned a dramatic exit. He'd built it because it needed to be built, and he was there and capable and, honestly, because he found a particular kind of satisfaction in making broken things work properly. It was the same instinct that made him rearrange the condiment situation at Lily's school every time he dropped her off and noticed it was disordered. He couldn't fix everything, but he could fix what was in front of him. The scaffolding coming down wasn't something he had engineered. He genuinely hadn't. That was an important distinction in his own mind, even if it wouldn't look that way from the outside. He wasn't sabotaging anything. He was simply no longer holding it up. There was a difference. He was certain of that. He was about 70% certain other people would see the difference. Victoria Langley became aware that things were deteriorating roughly 10 days after the all-hands meeting, which was actually faster than Ryan had expected. She became aware through James Whitmore, her chief of staff, who was competent and loyal in that particular order, and who had a habit of delivering bad news with a kind of apologetic precision that Victoria had told him twice she appreciated, and which he had therefore never changed. He came to her office on a Thursday afternoon with a folder, not a worn leather one, a crisp corporate one with the Novacor logo in the corner, and a look on his face that she had learned to associate with conversations she wasn't going to enjoy. She found out about this through her assistant, who mentioned it to his counterpart on the executive floor, who mentioned it to Dana's contact in the legal department, who mentioned it to Dana over lunch on Friday. The chain of information that ran through a company, Ryan had always thought, was its own kind of infrastructure, invisible, unmapped, and in certain critical moments far more reliable than anything the org chart suggested. What Victoria learned on that Thursday afternoon specifically, the Hendricks account was shaky, the Portland implementation was 11 days behind, and had required an emergency budget allocation, and 3 of the Eastern Division project leads had submitted transfer requests to HR citing leadership uncertainty as their primary reason. One of them had been with the company for 6 years. What she had not yet learned, that Ryan had submitted a formal board meeting request as a major shareholder, routed through the legal firm that managed his family's investment trust, and that the request was currently sitting in the inbox of the board chairman, a man named Gerald Holt, who had read it twice and who had, according to his own assistant's communication to the firm's paralegal, cleared his schedule for the following week without explanation. Ryan knew the request was sitting in Gerald Holt's inbox because the law firm sent him a confirmation, which he read on his phone during Lily's bath time on Thursday evening, while she narrated an elaborate underwater adventure involving Mr. Trunks and a washcloth she had decided was a submarine. The submarine can go very deep, she was explaining, because it's waterproof. All submarines are waterproof, Ryan said. That's the main qualification. Mr. Trunks is waterproof too. He's not, actually. I'd keep him above the surface. Lily considered this with her specific expression of someone weighing competing pieces of information. He can be above the surface, but still part of the mission, she decided. That seems like a reasonable compromise, Ryan said. He pocketed his phone and sat on the closed lid of the toilet and watched his daughter play in the bath and thought about Gerald Holt reading that request, and what his face probably looked like reading it, and what the next 7 days were going to contain. The confirmation had read, Board meeting formally scheduled. Friday, November 8th, 9:00 a.m. Attendance required of all board members and executive leadership. Agenda: Shareholder-initiated review of operational leadership and corporate governance. Shareholder-initiated review of operational leadership and corporate governance. 11 words that, to anyone who had spent meaningful time in a boardroom, communicated a very specific and very serious thing. To Victoria Langley, when that meeting invitation landed in her calendar at 7:47 the following morning, it would almost certainly read as a routine governance review. She would find it irritating but not alarming. She would prepare for it with the focused efficiency she brought to everything and walk in expecting a conversation she could control. Ryan knew this because he knew how she thought. 3 years of careful observation, 3 years of watching her miscalibrate her read of situations by consistently underestimating the people she had decided were beneath her. He had been, for 3 years, the most useful piece of her company's operating infrastructure. He had also been, for the same 3 years, the last person she would ever suspect of being a problem. He left Novacor officially on a Friday, not with a scene, not with a box of personal belongings carried through a silent office while people avoided eye contact. He spent his last week completing everything that was completable, documenting everything that was documentable, and sending a series of emails that were so thorough and professional and free of any visible emotion that 3 separate managers printed them out and kept physical copies because they were that useful. He told Dana on Wednesday afternoon. She was eating a salad at her desk, the kind of salad she ate when she was stressed. Very plain, very specific, no dressing. She set down her fork when he finished speaking and looked at him with an expression he would carry with him for a long time afterward. "You're actually leaving," she said. Not a question. End of the week. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Chicago was doing something complicated with the sky. Neither raining nor clearing, just holding, the clouds sitting low and heavy and indecisive. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Nowhere specific yet. I have some things to take care of." "The board meeting." He didn't answer that directly. She hadn't expected him to. "Dana," he said, "you are one of the best project coordinators I've worked with. I mean that without any qualification. You keep track of more moving parts than any 3 people I know, and you do it while managing the emotional reality of a room, which is a skill most people don't even know is a skill." He paused. "Whatever happens here over the next month, you're going to be fine. I want you to know that." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were slightly bright, which she would have been furious to have acknowledged. "Are you saying goodbye to me right now?" "I'm saying some version of it." "That's a very Ryan way to handle this." "I know." She picked up her fork, put it back down, picked it up again. "Will you tell me, at some point, what this actually was? What you actually did?" "Yes," he said. "When it makes sense to tell it." "And when will that be?" He thought about Gerald Holt's cleared schedule, about the board meeting notice sitting in Victoria Langley's calendar, about the 342 pages of documentation currently organized in 2 binders and a secured digital file maintained by his family's legal trust. "Soon," he said. "I think pretty soon." On his last day, he came in at his normal time. He sat at his desk and worked until noon. He went to lunch at the sandwich place 2 blocks over that had been his Friday lunch spot for 3 years, turkey on wheat, no mayo, the chips that came in the small paper bag, and ate it on a bench in the plaza even though it was 41 degrees out, because he wanted the air and the quiet and the particular quality of November light in Chicago, which was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but which had a gray, honest quality he had always found oddly clarifying. He thought about the first day he had walked into Novacor, 32 months earlier, in a different jacket, but the same polished shoes. He had known within the first 6 weeks what the company actually was underneath its branding. He could always read an organization that way, the same way certain people can read a room. He had also known within 6 weeks that it was capable of being considerably better than what it was, if someone built the right structure under it. He had built the structure. He hadn't built it as a trap. He hadn't built it as leverage. He had built it because he was constitutionally incapable of doing a job halfway, and because there were 300 people in that building who came to work every morning and tried their best and deserved to work in a system that rewarded that rather than punishing it. He thought about Lily. She had asked him that morning, with the slightly anxious directness of a 7-year-old who had absorbed more than she should have from grown-up conversations happening in adjacent rooms, whether he was still going to have a job. "I'll always have work to do," he'd told her. "That's not the same as a job," she'd said, 7 years old, sharp as a tack and not interested in being managed. "No," he'd admitted. "It's not exactly the same, but I promise you we're fine. Are we okay?" She'd thought about it with visible seriousness. Then, "Are we going to have pasta tonight?" "We can absolutely have pasta." "Then we're okay," she'd decided, and picked up her backpack with the efficiency of someone who had resolved the matter and was moving on. He ate the last of the chips. The board meeting was in 8 days. He stood up from the bench, brushed the crumbs off his jacket, and walked back to the building to finish his last day of being Ryan Ashford, unremarkable project manager, 32nd floor, 9th floor, worn leather folder, polished shoes. He badged in through the lobby. Marcus was at the security desk. "Cold out there?" Marcus said. "Getting colder," Ryan agreed. "You have a good weekend, Mr. Ashford." "You too, Marcus." He took the elevator to 9. He sat back down at his desk. He finished the last 4 items on his task list, sent his final email at 5:47, logged out of the system with the same absence of ceremony with which he had done everything else, and walked out of Novacor Technologies carrying nothing except his worn leather folder. The building's revolving door pushed him out into the cold, and the city was loud and gray and indifferent, and the clouds above South Wacker Drive held their low, heavy position, still neither raining nor clearing, just sitting with all that weight, waiting for something to shift. In 8 days, Victoria Langley was going to walk into a room thinking she understood the situation completely. Ryan walked to his car and drove home to make pasta. The Friday of the board meeting arrived the way significant days usually do, without any particular announcement, slipping in behind an ordinary Thursday night like it was nothing special, just another entry on a calendar, just another morning requiring coffee and shoes and the basic organizational effort of getting out the door. Ryan was up at 5. Not because of nerves, he had examined himself carefully on that question and arrived at the same answer he'd given Dana 2 weeks earlier, which was that he was not nervous in the conventional sense. There was something present in his chest, some quality of aliveness to the morning that wasn't quite adrenaline and wasn't quite calm, but lived somewhere in the narrow territory between them. He had felt it before, twice. Once the night before his first major project presentation, after 3 months at a job that had been asking more of him than he'd been officially given credit for. And once in a hospital waiting room when Lily was 4 and had a fever that spiked to 104, and he had sat with his hands pressed flat on his thighs and breathed through his nose and waited for someone in scrubs to come through a door and tell him something. Both times the feeling had resolved into something manageable. He trusted it would again. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the city do its early morning thing. The delivery trucks, the runners who were out regardless of weather. The slow awakening of streetlights going from necessary to redundant as the sky shifted from black to the particular dark blue of 6 o'clock in November. Chicago in November had its own specific personality. Blunt, slightly combative, not interested in softening the experience of being outside. He appreciated that about it. He was dressed by 6:15. Not the charcoal jacket, a different one, darker, better fitted, the one that had been sitting in the back of his closet for an occasion he hadn't named but had been aware of needing. Same polished shoes. The leather folder was on the counter beside his keys, but he was also carrying, for the first time, a slim briefcase borrowed from his late father's collection that held a USB drive, a printed copy of the 342-page documentation binder, and a letter from the law firm managing the Ashford Family Investment Trust that confirmed, in the precise and unemotional language of legal correspondence, exactly what Ryan owned and for exactly how long he had owned it. He heard Lily's feet on the hallway floor at 6:30, the specific shuffling sound of a 7-year-old not quite awake but functional enough to navigate toward the kitchen on autopilot. She appeared in the doorway in her pajamas with Mr. Trunks under one arm and her hair in the condition that 3 hours of pillow contact reliably produced. She looked at him, took in the jacket, the briefcase, the unusual quality of his stillness at that hour. "You look different," she said. "Good different or bad different?" She considered it without any rush. "Like when you have a really important thing," she decided. "That's pretty accurate," he said. She climbed onto the kitchen stool. He poured her orange juice and started on her breakfast. Toast, the peanut butter that came in the blue jar because she had decided at some point that the blue jar was superior and had not revisited this position, half a banana. "Is it going to be okay?" she asked. He set her toast in front of her. "Yes." "You always say that." "I say it when it's true," he said, "and sometimes when I'm not completely sure but I need it to be true enough to act on." She looked at him with the unsettling directness children occasionally deploy. "Which one is today?" He picked up his coffee. "About 70-30 in favor of actually true," he said. She nodded slowly, as if this were a satisfactory margin. Then she bit into her toast and looked at Mr. Trunks and told him something in a low voice that Ryan didn't catch. And the morning moved forward the way mornings do, regardless of what they contain. He dropped Lily at school at 7:50. She climbed out of the car and turned back and said, "Tell me what happens," with the gravity of someone who understood the stakes without knowing the specifics, which was in some ways more unsettling than if she'd known everything. He told her he would. She nodded once, like a general receiving a report, and walked toward the school entrance without looking back. He watched her go. Then he drove to the meeting. The law offices of Holt, Carver, and Price occupied the 41st floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue, and Gerald Holt had chosen to host the board meeting there rather than at Novacor's headquarters, a decision that communicated something very clear to anyone with enough experience to read it. When the board met on company premises, it was a routine matter. When the board met at outside counsel, something structural was being considered. Ryan arrived at 8:47. The receptionist showed him to a conference room, large, high-ceilinged, with the city laid out below through floor-to-ceiling windows, which on any other day he might have found impressive. Right now he found it a room with a table and chairs and a view that would not affect any of the things that were about to happen in it. Gerald Holt was already there. He was 71, white-haired, built like someone who had played college football 50 years ago, and still had the structural memory of it in his shoulders. He had been on the Novacor board since its early restructuring, had been the one to facilitate the original deal with the Ashford Trust, and was, in Ryan's experience of him across 3 years of careful proxy observation, a man who took his responsibilities seriously and had very little patience for theatrics. He rose when Ryan entered, not a perfunctory rise, a deliberate one, with the full weight of what it meant. "Ryan," he said, extending his hand. "Gerald." Ryan shook it. The handshake was firm on both sides, brief, nothing performed about it. "Coffee's there," Gerald said, gesturing to the sideboard. "The others will be here shortly. Victoria's expected at 9. She doesn't know I'll be here. She knows there's a major shareholder requesting the review. She doesn't know the identity. I kept it that way at your counsel's request." Gerald looked at him steadily. "I want you to know, Ryan, what you've put together. I've been on 9 boards over 30 years. I've seen people come in with documentation." He paused. "I've never seen anything quite like what you submitted." Ryan sat down. "I just kept records of what I saw." "You kept records the way other people keep records of nothing," Gerald said. "There's a difference between recording facts and recording facts in a way that tells the whole story. Yours tells the whole story." They sat in a particular kind of quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just the quiet of two people who understood the same gravity. The other board members arrived between 8:50 and 8:58. 5 of them, ranging in age from 53 to 67, 2 women and 3 men, all with the composed exterior of people who had learned decades ago not to show what they were processing in real time. Several of them knew Ryan by name. He had, after all, been interfacing with board-level reporting for 3 years, just never as anyone with a chair at the table. They greeted him with a neutrality that was itself informative, not cold, not warm, waiting. At 9:03, the conference room door opened and Victoria Langley walked in. She was wearing the same fitted navy blazer she'd worn at the all-hands meeting 3 weeks earlier, and she had the particular expression she carried into rooms where she expected to manage the situation: forward, alert, already categorizing. She had James Whitmore a step behind her and a leather portfolio of her own under her arm, and she crossed the threshold of that conference room with the momentum of someone who had done her preparation and was ready for the conversation. She stopped. The momentum didn't disappear all at once. It took about 2 seconds, the time it took for her eyes to move around the room, to register the assembled board members, to find Gerald Holt standing near the head of the table. And then, in the precise moment, her scan of the room reached the chair where Ryan Ashford sat quietly, with his hands folded on the table in front of him and his father's briefcase beside his chair, to understand that something was profoundly wrong with her map of this situation. She recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly. That was one of the things that made her genuinely formidable. Her expression moved through something complicated and came out the other side in about a second and a half, landing on a version of composed alertness. "Gerald," she said, "I didn't realize we'd be—" "Ryan." The pause before his name was very small. "I didn't know you'd be attending this meeting." "He's attending in a specific capacity," Gerald said. "Please sit down, Victoria. I'll explain." She sat. James Whitmore sat beside her, and Ryan watched the chief of staff clock the situation with the particular look of someone who is very good at his job and has just realized that his preparation for this morning may have been conducted based on incomplete information. Gerald remained standing. He picked up the folder in front of him and opened it to the first page, and when he began speaking, his voice had the steady, unhurried quality of someone delivering information that he had reviewed carefully and that he intended to get through completely regardless of the response. "This board meeting has been called at the formal request of a major shareholder in Novacor Technologies," he said. "That shareholder holds a 17.8% equity stake in the company, which represents the second largest individual ownership position after the combined institutional holdings." He looked at Victoria. "The shareholder is Ryan Ashford, specifically Ryan Ashford as the principal beneficiary and managing trustee of the Ashford Family Investment Trust, which acquired this stake 3 years and 4 months ago when the trust provided the capital that prevented Novacor from entering bankruptcy proceedings." The room was completely quiet. Victoria's face did something that Ryan had never seen her face do before in 3 years of observation. It went blank. Not the controlled blankness of someone managing their expression. A genuine, unguarded blankness, the kind that happens when the cognitive architecture that normally processes incoming information runs into something it has no existing category for. James Whitmore had gone very still beside her. Gerald continued. Mr. Ashford has, for the entirety of his time at Novacor, operated as an employee of the company without disclosing this ownership position to executive leadership. This was legally permissible under the terms of the original investment agreement, which specified a 5-year confidentiality period at the trust's discretion. He has now elected, within his rights, to disclose his position and to bring before this board a formal review request regarding corporate governance and executive leadership practices. He set the folder down. Ryan, he said, the floor is yours. Oh. Ryan opened his briefcase. He took out the documentation binder and set it on the table. It made a substantial sound when it landed. 342 pages of facts did that. Then he took out the USB drive and set it beside the binder, and then he took out 7 individual tabbed folders, each representing a separate category of documentation, and arranged them in a line in front of him with the same methodical care he brought to everything. He looked at Victoria. She was looking at him. The blankness had resolved into something more complex. He could see the intelligence working behind her eyes, recategorizing, reconstructing. She was doing what she always did, which was processing at speed. But the speed wasn't helping her this time because the information she was processing was not an obstacle to be strategized around. It was simply a fact. He had been here for 3 years. He had owned a piece of her company for 3 years. He had watched everything. I want to be clear about something before I begin, Ryan said, and his voice in that room was exactly the same voice he used when he was walking Dana through a project timeline or explaining to Lily why the submarine needed to stay above water. I didn't build the documentation I'm presenting today as a weapon. I built it because I believe accurate records of how an organization treats people are important, and because I believed someone needed to keep those records even if no one was asking them to. He paused, not for effect, because he wanted the next sentence to be accurate, and because I believed that if the records were ever needed, they should be complete. He opened the first tabbed folder. What followed was not a dramatic accusation. It wasn't a speech. It was methodical and factual, and took 47 minutes. And in some ways, those 47 minutes were more devastating than any confrontation could have been, precisely because they were so untheatrical. He walked the board through 3 years of documented promotion decisions in the Chicago and Eastern divisions, cross-referenced against measurable performance metrics. He showed the gap between the performance of the people who were promoted and the performance of the people who were passed over. He showed specific instances where the distinguishing factor between a promotion and a passover correlated with the candidate's proximity to Victoria's inner circle rather than any objective measure of results. He didn't characterize these findings. He presented them and let the numbers characterize themselves. He walked them through the Meridian account, the original crisis, the decisions that had created the crisis, who had made those decisions, who had absorbed the consequences of those decisions, and who had received credit for the recovery. The timeline was documented to the day. The email chains were preserved and printed. The client communication logs were organized chronologically, with annotations identifying every intervention that had reversed the account's trajectory. His name appeared in those annotations in connection with 37 separate interventions over 8 months. Tom Bridger's name appeared in connection with the credit allocation on the final recovery report. He showed them the Portland contract, the 9 months of negotiation, the internal communication records showing who had done the work and who had presented the outcomes. He showed them the Q3 report with the financial projection errors that he had corrected before board submission, errors that, uncorrected, would have produced a material misstatement in a document that went to shareholders. He showed them the transfer requests Dana had mentioned, 3 of them, all from experienced division-level project leads, all citing leadership uncertainty, all submitted within 2 weeks of the Bridger appointment, all currently sitting in HR without formal response. He showed them 18 months of meeting minutes documenting patterns and how ideas were received depending on their source, how credit was allocated depending on relationships, how errors were assigned, depending on whether the person who made them was inside or outside a specific circle of favor. He set down the last folder. I want to be accurate, he said, about what I am and am not presenting here. I am not presenting evidence of financial fraud. I am not presenting evidence of illegal conduct. What I am presenting is a documented record of a leadership culture that has systematically rewarded proximity over performance, and that has, over time, produced measurable damage to client relationships, project outcomes, and the retention of qualified people. He looked at each board member in turn. The question I'm asking this board to consider is whether that leadership culture is what you want to continue building on. He closed the last folder. The silence in the room had a different quality than the silence of 47 minutes earlier. That silence had been the silence of shock. This silence was the silence of people who had just read a diagnosis and were taking a moment before deciding what to do with it. Victoria spoke. Her voice was controlled. He had to give her that. Whatever was happening inside her, the surface held. These are Ryan's interpretations of selected data, she said. I'd want our own data team to review the source documentation before any conclusions are drawn. That's completely appropriate, Ryan said. I've provided full source access on the USB drive. The documentation includes original files, unedited communication logs, and a methodology summary for the analysis. An independent review will confirm the same findings. You said you weren't here for 3 years as a plant, she said. The word plant came out with an edge. But you've been documenting everything from day one. You had a stake in this company from before you walked in the door. How is this not a setup? He had expected this question. He had thought about it carefully and had the honest answer ready. Because if I had wanted to set you up, he said, I wouldn't have spent 3 years fixing things. I would have let them break faster. He paused. I fixed things because they needed fixing. I documented what I saw because it was worth documenting. Those are two separate decisions that point in opposite directions if your goal is to cause damage. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what is your goal? She asked. To answer that accurately, Ryan said, I need you to understand something about why I came to work at Novacor in the first place. He told them about the bankruptcy situation, not in detail, that was documented in the original trust filings, but in essence. The trust had acquired the stake because a financial advisor with good instincts had flagged the underlying technology assets and the contract portfolio as undervalued. The bankruptcy risk was real, but the underlying business was worth saving. The trust had provided capital to save it. He had come to work there because he had wanted to understand what was actually wrong with the operational structure, not from financial documents, but from inside the machine, at ground level, in the daily reality of how decisions were made and why they were made the way they were. 3 years ago, he said, this company had the skeleton of something genuinely good. The technology, the client base, the market position, all real, all worth protecting. What it didn't have was a leadership culture that could sustain growth without burning through the people who were doing the actual work. He looked at Victoria. That's still true. The skeleton is still there. The client relationships are still recoverable. The division structures I built are still functional even after the last 3 weeks, which tells you something about how overbuilt I made them. I built them to survive mistakes. He looked at the board. What isn't sustainable is asking good people to keep showing up in a system that doesn't see them. Gerald Holt spoke for the first time since turning the floor over. What outcome are you requesting, Ryan? Formally. Formally, I'm requesting an independent external audit of the governance and leadership practices I've documented, conducted by a firm this board selects with no input from me. I'm requesting that the audit findings be presented to the full board within 60 days. And I'm requesting that the board make its own determination about what those findings require. Gerald looked at him. You're not requesting specific action regarding executive leadership? I'm presenting facts to people who have the authority to make decisions about this company, Ryan said. That's their job, not mine. Another silence. This one had a different quality still. Something almost like respect, though it wasn't quite that. Something more complicated than respect. Victoria said, You've been in this company for 3 years, Ryan. You've seen what I've built. I have, he said. And you've seen what I was trying to build. I've seen that too, he said. And I think you actually care about it. That's not in question. He held her gaze, and his voice didn't change in temperature or pace. What's in question is whether the way you've been building it is going to get you there. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you've had doubts about that too. The last 3 weeks gave you evidence. Her jaw was tight, but something else was happening behind her eyes. Something that wasn't the combative sharpness she'd walked in with. something that might, under other circumstances and with enough time, have looked like the beginning of a reckoning. "I didn't know who you were," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was something stranger, almost a question, directed less at him than at herself. "No," he said. "But that's the thing, Victoria. You knew what I did. You had the records. You had the client outcomes, the project results, the performance data. The knowledge of who I was shouldn't have changed any of that. That's the point." The sentence sat in the room. Gerald Holt cleared his throat. "I think we have everything we need to proceed with a formal board discussion. Victoria, I'll ask you and James to step out while we deliberate preliminary procedure." Victoria stood. She had the bearing of someone holding themselves together through conscious effort, every posture decision requiring more work than it usually did. She picked up her portfolio. She looked at Ryan one more time. He looked back at her without triumph and without pity and without anything that was performing either. She turned and walked to the door. James Whitmore followed her. When the door closed, Gerald Holt let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands. The first entirely unguarded thing Ryan had seen him do. Two of the other board members exchanged a look that conveyed approximately 3 paragraphs of subtext in about half a second. A woman named Patricia Reyes, who sat on 2 other boards and who had been taking precise handwritten notes throughout the presentation, set down her pen and looked at Ryan with an expression that was not quite sympathetic and not quite analytical, but carried elements of both. "Ryan," she said, "I have to ask you something and I need a straight answer." "Go ahead." "Did you know 3 years ago when you walked in that it was going to come to this?" He thought about the question. He thought about the 5:15 mornings and the bent spoke umbrella and the handoff notes that took him until midnight and the client calls on his personal phone and the performance reports he'd corrected that had never carried his name. He thought about Lily asking him that morning whether it was going to be okay, and him saying 70-30 in favor of actually true. "No," he said. "I knew the company needed work. I knew the culture was going to be a problem. I knew I was going to see things worth documenting." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, then back up. "I didn't know it was going to be as bad as it was. I wanted to be wrong about that." Patricia Reyes looked at him a moment longer. Then she picked her pen back up. "All right," Gerald said. "Let's talk about next steps." The deliberation lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Ryan was not in the room for most of it. He waited in a smaller conference room down the hall with a view of the elevator bank and a cup of coffee that went cold while he sat with his forearms on the table and looked at nothing in particular. He was not thinking about the board deliberation. He trusted the board to deliberate. He had given them what they needed to do that, and the outcome was no longer in his hands, which was the only place an outcome could go before it became real. He was thinking about his father who had died 6 years ago, who had been a contractor in the South Side, who had polished his work boots every morning before job sites the same way Ryan polished his shoes now, and who had told him once, when Ryan was maybe 14 and had watched a man at his father's company take credit for work 3 other men had done, that the problem wasn't the man who took the credit. The problem, his father had said, with the particular bluntness of someone who had figured something out the hard way and saw no reason to soften it, is the system that led him. You can hate the person or you can fix the system. Hating the person is easier, and it doesn't help anything. His father hadn't been a perfect man. He'd had a temper, a complicated relationship with patients, a stubbornness that occasionally calcified into something close to rigidity. But he'd been honest about the things that mattered, and some of those honest things had become load-bearing walls in the structure of who Ryan was. He drank some of the cold coffee. At 11:43, Gerald Holt appeared in the doorway of the small conference room. Ryan looked up. Gerald's expression was contained, but there was something in it. Not satisfaction, more like the look of someone who has made a difficult but necessary decision and has arrived on the other side of it. "The board has made its determination," he said. "Come back in, Bon." Victoria was already in the conference room when he returned, which meant she had been called back separately. She was seated now, not standing, and something about her posture had shifted in the hour he'd been waiting. She was still upright, still composed in the technical sense, but there was a quality to it that was different from how she'd sat at the beginning, less in command of the room and more simply present in it. James Whitmore was not with her. That was notable. Gerald stood at the head of the table and spoke with the deliberate pace of someone who had thought carefully about each sentence. The board has voted to commission an independent governance audit as requested. The firm will be announced within 5 business days. Separately, and after careful deliberation, the board has voted to accept Victoria Langley's resignation from the position of Chief Executive Officer of Novacor Technologies, effective immediately, pending transition agreements to be finalized with Council. He paused. This decision was not made lightly. The board acknowledges Ms. Langley's role in growing this company to its current position. It was made in recognition of the documented pattern of leadership practices that are incompatible with the company's long-term interests and the well-being of its people. Victoria did not react in any visible way. She sat with her hands folded on the portfolio in front of her and looked at a point on the table that was not Ryan and was not Gerald and was not any of the other board members. Her jaw was set. She was breathing deliberately, the way people do when they are working very hard to stay in the room. Gerald looked at Ryan. The board will be discussing interim and permanent CEO arrangements in the coming days. We'd like your input as a major shareholder. Ryan nodded once. I have a recommendation, he said, when you're ready for it. We're ready, Patricia Reyes said. He reached into his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. He slid it to the center of the table. Ellen Park, currently heading the Midwest Division. 7 years at the company, consistent performance record, cross-department respect. She has never been in Victoria's inner circle, which is a qualification, not a liability. He paused. She knows how to build things without burning people. The board members looked at the sheet. Gerald picked it up. Victoria, very quietly, said, I don't get to say anything about this. You can say whatever you'd like to say, Gerald told her. This is a board determination. She was silent for a moment. Then she looked at Ryan directly, for the first time since before the deliberation. I want to know, she said. Just, I want to know. For 3 years you fixed things. You built things. You stayed late. You covered for people who didn't deserve it. You had the power to do any of this at any time. Her voice was controlled, but the control was costing her. Why didn't you just... Why stay? It was a real question. He could tell it was real. Because leaving the first time things get hard isn't the same as leaving for the right reason, he said. And because there were people in that building who needed it to work. Not for me. For themselves. He looked at her steadily. I stayed as long as staying meant something. When it stopped meaning something, I left. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness exactly. Not forgiveness exactly. Something more private than either. She looked down at the table. Outside the 41st floor windows, Chicago had finally made up its mind about the sky. The clouds had broken, not dramatically, not in any cinematic sweep of light, but in the gradual, workmanlike way clouds break over a city that has been gray for most of November, piece by piece, letting through cold blue that was not warm, but was at least honest. Ryan looked out the window for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase and the worn leather folder that he had carried into and out of Novacor Technologies for 3 years. And he thanked the board members by name, and he walked out of the conference room at 11:57 on a Friday morning in November, stepping into a hallway that was quiet and carpeted and smelled like coffee and recirculated air and the particular neutral quality of buildings that contain consequential things. He took the elevator down. He walked out into the cold. He called Lily's after-school program and left a message that he'd be picking her up himself today instead of Mrs. Garza, and that she should wait by the front desk, and that if she had finished her reading homework, they could maybe stop for hot chocolate on the way home. He stood on the sidewalk on North Michigan Avenue with his father's briefcase in his hand, and the cold air doing what November air does, and he thought 70-30 had been a conservative estimate. Then he went to get his daughter. The hot chocolate was Lily's idea of a debrief. She sat across from him at the small table by the window in the coffee shop 2 blocks from her school, both hands wrapped around a mug that was slightly too large for her, and she watched him with the particular focused attention she reserved for things she considered important. She had whipped cream on her upper lip and had not noticed yet, and he didn't tell her because she looked so serious, and the whipped cream made the seriousness considerably more bearable. So it went okay, she said. Not a question. It went okay. The important thing happened? The important thing happened, he confirmed. She processed this with the gravity it apparently deserved. Then she took another sip of hot chocolate and said, "Can we have pasta tonight anyway?" "We can absolutely have pasta tonight." "Okay." She set the mug down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a vessel slightly beyond their grip strength. "Mr. Trunks says congratulations. Tell Mr. Trunks I appreciate that." She relayed this in a low voice to the stuffed elephant sitting beside her on the bench, nodding seriously at whatever response she received, and Ryan drank his coffee and watched his daughter commune with a stuffed elephant in a coffee shop window while Chicago moved past outside, and he held the specific weight of the afternoon in his chest without trying to resolve it into something simpler than it was. It wasn't triumph. He had expected to feel something cleaner than what he actually felt, but the actual feeling was more complicated, something that involved relief and tiredness in roughly equal measure, and underneath both of those something that might have been grief, though he couldn't immediately identify what specifically he was grieving. Maybe the 3 years. Maybe what those 3 years had required of him. Maybe the simpler version of the story he'd carried in the early months. The version where he fixed the scaffolding and the building repaired itself and nobody had to be removed from anything. He had never wanted anyone removed from anything. That was the truth that didn't fit neatly into any version of the story that would be told about this. He finished his coffee. Lily finished her hot chocolate, finally noticed the whipped cream on her lip, addressed it with the sleeve of her coat, and reached for her backpack with the air of someone ready to conclude the meeting. "Pasta time?" she said. "Pasta time," he agreed. The news moved through NovaCore Technologies, the way all significant internal news moved, faster than any official communication, assembled from fragments and partial information and the particular interpretive creativity of people who are trying to understand something important with incomplete data. By Monday morning, the essential facts were widely known. Victoria Langley was out. An external audit had been commissioned. Ellen Park, who had been running the Midwest Division with consistent results for 7 years, and who was known across multiple floors primarily for being direct, fair, and immune to the social calculus that had defined the previous leadership culture, had been named interim CEO pending a formal board confirmation process. What was not yet widely known, or rather what existed only as rumor in various degrees of accuracy, was the identity of the shareholder who had requested the board review. Some people said it was a hedge fund, some said it was a consortium of the East Coast institutional holders. One version that circulated through the legal department held that it was a former executive who had left 2 years ago under circumstances nobody could quite remember clearly. Dana Cho, who had a better information network than anyone else on the 9th floor, and possibly in the entire building, knew exactly who it was by Sunday evening. She had figured it out through a combination of careful reasoning and a conversation with a paralegal at Holt, Carver & Price, who had mentioned without intending to that the shareholders' legal representation had been in place for over 3 years. She sent Ryan a text at 8:47 Sunday night. It was 3 words. "I figured it out." He replied 4 minutes later. "I know you did." Then after a moment, "Thank you for being patient." She replied, "I want the full story. You'll have it. Give me a few days." She sent back a single period, which in Dana's communication style was the equivalent of a very controlled version of several stronger reactions, and he appreciated the restraint. Ellen Park called Ryan on Monday morning at 8:15, before most of the building had finished their first cup of coffee. He was in his kitchen, having dropped Lily at school, standing at the counter with his phone and the remnants of breakfast, and the particular mental clarity that came from having slept, genuinely slept, for the first time in several weeks. "Ryan." Her voice was the same as it always was. Direct, not unfriendly, slightly impatient in the way of someone whose default setting was efficiency. They had worked on 2 cross-divisional projects over the years, never closely, but closely enough for him to have formed an accurate picture of who she was. "Ellen," he said, "congratulations and condolences." In that order. A short silence. "That's a precise way to put it." "It's an accurate one. The job is real. The situation you're inheriting is also real. The board told me it was your recommendation." "I recommended someone I thought could do it well," he said. "They made the decision." "Don't do that, don't minimize it." Her voice had a note in it, not irritation, more like the directness of someone who found false modesty as wasteful as actual modesty was virtuous. "I want to know why you recommended me, the real reason, not the version for the board." He put down his coffee cup. Because you've been in that building for 7 years and you've never once used someone else's mistake to make yourself look better. I've watched you do it the other way. Take responsibility for team errors in front of leadership and address them internally. Not because it was strategic, because that's how you actually think about teams. He paused. That's the thing the company needs most right now. Not vision statements, not restructuring plans. Someone who actually understands that the people doing the work are the product. Another silence, longer. The audit is going to find things I've been part of too, Ryan. Not in the way the documentation shows for senior leadership, but I was in that culture. I made accommodations for it. I know, he said. That's in there. I wasn't trying to present a perfect picture of anyone. I was presenting an accurate one. He picked up his coffee again. The difference between you and what the audit will find about the executive level is the difference between someone who worked within a broken system and someone who built it to stay broken. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if I can do this. You can, he said. You'll make mistakes, probably significant ones in the first 6 months because this situation is a mess and you're stepping into it cold. But you'll make them honestly and fix them honestly. And that's going to be the thing that actually matters to the people in that building right now. I need something from you, she said. Ask it. I need you to be available, not officially, not on an org chart, not in any formal capacity, just available. When I have a question about the systems, about the accounts, about the history of decisions that are going to come up in the audit and that I'm going to need to understand the background of. A pause. I know that's an unusual ask given the circumstances. Ryan thought about it. Not for long. He had, in some form, already thought about it. Send me a calendar invite for a call at the end of each week. 30 minutes. If you have things you need to understand, we use those 30 minutes. If you don't, we hang up in 5. That's very measured of you. I'm a measured person. Ryan, the impatience in her voice had shifted into something more careful. Did you want this job? The CEO position? Be straight with me. He stood at his kitchen counter and thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. Not the answer he would give in a boardroom or in a conversation that was being observed, but the actual answer, the one that lived at the level below strategy. No, he said. What I wanted was to not have spent 3 years watching good people leave or get pushed out because they weren't in the right circle. That's what I wanted fixed. The job is beside that. She took a moment with this. Okay, she said finally. Send me the account files on Hendricks first. I need to start there. Already compiled. I'll send them this afternoon. Good. A pause. Thank you, Ryan, and I mean that more specifically than it probably sounds. I know you do, he said. Good luck, Ellen. He hung up and finished his coffee. Oh. The governance audit began on the 22nd of November and ran for 38 days, conducted by an external firm out of Washington, D.C., that specialized in organizational governance reviews for mid to large private companies. They were thorough in the way that firms with genuine reputations for thoroughness are thorough, not just reviewing documentation, but conducting structured interviews with 47 employees across 6 divisions, administering anonymous surveys to the full staff population, analyzing compensation records and promotion timelines going back to the company's restructuring, and mapping the decision-making patterns in executive leadership against stated company policy. Ryan cooperated fully with the audit process. He made himself available for 2 formal interviews and provided the auditors with complete access to everything in his documentation. He answered every question directly and without editorializing, correcting the record when the interviewer's framing contained assumptions he thought were inaccurate, including assumptions that were favorable to him. The lead auditor, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who had the precise, unhurried quality of someone who had conducted this kind of review many times and had learned not to be surprised by what it found, told him near the end of their second interview that his documentation was the most comprehensive employee-level record she had encountered in 20 years of this work. I want to ask you something off the record, she said at the end of their session. There is no off the record with me, he said, but ask it anyway. She looked at him steadily. She had a way of looking at people that communicated that she was not going to be managed or redirected, and he found it straightforwardly admirable. Did you ever consider coming forward earlier, before the promotion announcement? Yes. What stopped you? He thought about this. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. I wasn't sure what the right threshold was, he said. Things were bad in ways that I could document, but they weren't. They hadn't yet risen to the point where I was certain the documentation alone would be enough to justify what coming forward would require. He paused. And I was hoping it would get better. That was probably naive. It usually is, she said, in a tone that was not unkind. In my experience, cultures like this one don't self-correct. They require external pressure or they escalate. Yes, he said. I know that now more concretely than I did before. She closed her notebook. For what it's worth, she said, with the careful phrasing of someone who rarely editorialized professionally, what you documented here, the consistency, the specificity, the absence of personal grievance as an organizing framework, it's not what we usually see. People who build documentation like this usually have an axe to grind. The record is usually shaped by the axe. I had something to resolve, Ryan said. That's different from an axe. She considered this distinction. Yes, she said. I think it is. Tom Bridger resigned on the 14th of December, the third week of the audit, before the findings were formally released. The resignation letter that circulated through the building, as resignation letters always circulated despite being confidential, was brief and attributed his departure to a desire to pursue other opportunities, which was true in the sense that all available options had become other opportunities. He stopped by the 9th floor on his last day. Ryan was not there, so he had no ongoing presence at the company at that point, his formal employment having ended the previous month. But Dana was, and she told Ryan about it that evening in a phone call. He came to your old desk, she said. He just kind of stood there for a minute. What did he do? He asked where you were. I told him you weren't in. He nodded and said, this is a direct quote, he always knew what was happening, didn't he? Ryan said nothing for a moment. What did you say? I said yes. That seemed like the honest answer. It is, Ryan said. He also asked me to tell you, if I talked to you, that he was sorry. He didn't specify for what exactly. I got the impression he meant generally. Ryan thought about Tom Bridger standing at his empty desk. Tom, who had finger-gunned him and called him buddy, and handed him the Hendricks account background notes without reading them. Tom, who was not a villain. That was the thing people wanted in stories like this. A clean villain to hold all the wrongdoing, and the reality was so much less satisfying than that. Tom was a man who had been rewarded for the wrong things for long enough that he had stopped being able to see the difference between what he'd earned and what he'd been given. Tell him I heard it, Ryan said. If the opportunity comes up, that's a very measured response. People keep telling me that. The audit findings were released in their formal summary form to the board on the 28th of December, a date that felt slightly surreal, sitting between the holidays the way it did, the kind of date that made the institutional gravity of the findings feel incongruous with the rest of the world's preoccupation with other things. Ryan read the summary at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Lily was at a friend's birthday party, 2 hours he had spent in unfamiliar quiet, working through 83 pages with a cup of coffee and a pen, he ended up not using because there was nothing in the findings he needed to annotate. He already knew what was in them. He had, in some sense, written the first draft 3 years ago without knowing that's what he was doing. The findings confirmed the documented patterns of preferential promotion. They confirmed the systematic underutilization of performance metrics in leadership decisions. They confirmed the impact on retention and project outcomes. They also found things Ryan had not specifically documented, a compensation disparity that had developed over 3 years in which employees within the inner circle had been advanced at salary rates that diverged significantly from peer groups with equivalent or superior performance records, and a pattern in the leadership team's communication practices that the auditors described as creating a selective accountability culture, in which errors were addressed or ignored based on the relationship status of the person who made them, rather than the nature of the error. They also found, as Ellen Park had predicted they would, that the culture had been pervasive enough that it had shaped behavior at multiple levels. The report was careful about this. It was not assigning uniform culpability across the organization. It was documenting how an environment created at the top becomes the environment everyone operates in, whether they wanted it to be or not. Ryan set the last page down. He thought about the 3 junior analysts on the 9th floor, who had, in his time there, submitted ideas in team meetings that were overlooked, and then submitted the same ideas 6 months later through someone with more visibility and watched them get adopted. He thought about a project coordinator named Amara, who had been passed over for a senior role twice, once in favor of a man who had asked her for help preparing his application, and who had left the company 8 months ago for a competitor and was, according to Dana's network, thriving. He thought about the 6-year veteran who had submitted a transfer request the week after the Bridger appointment. He thought about all the small daily erosions that don't make it into any single piece of documentation, but that accumulate over time in the people who experience them. The specific damage of being consistently told by a system that your work is worth less than someone else's politics. He thought about his father polishing his work boots. He sat with the weight of the report for a while, not in the self-congratulatory way of someone who had been proven right, more in the way of someone for whom being proven right had never been the point, and who was now confronting the actual size of the thing he'd spent 3 years standing inside of. He got up and washed his coffee cup and thought about what came next. Ellen Park's first all-hands meeting as confirmed CEO of Novacore Technologies was held on January 15th in the same atrium on the 12th floor where Victoria Langley had announced Tom Bridger's promotion 10 weeks earlier. Ryan was not there. He watched a summary of it. Dana recorded 30 seconds on her phone and sent it to him without comment, knowing he would understand what she was sending and why. Ellen stood at the same podium, in front of the same branded backdrop, before what looked like the same 400 people. She was 51, Korean-American, with close-cropped hair and glasses, and the kind of face that communicated that she was paying genuine attention to whatever was in front of her. She did not use a microphone in the way Victoria had used a microphone, as a tool for performance. She used it as a practical device for being heard. She talked for 14 minutes. She didn't use the word innovation once. She talked about what the audit had found and what it meant, which was an unusual thing for a new CEO to do. Most incoming leaders preferred to characterize the past briefly and pivot quickly to the future, but Ellen Park apparently had a different theory of what people needed to hear. She said that the company had operated under a leadership culture that had failed a significant number of its people, and that she intended to take that seriously rather than paper over it with vision statements. She talked about what would change, not in the broad strokes of sloganeering, but in specifics. Promotion decisions would be reviewed by a cross-functional committee that included peers of the candidates, not just senior leadership. Performance evaluations would include a standardized metric component that couldn't be overridden without documented justification. The anonymous employee survey that the audit had administered would become a quarterly practice. She did not promise perfection. She said specifically, "I'll make mistakes in this role. I'm already aware of at least 2 decisions I've made in the first 3 weeks that I'll probably want to revisit. What I can promise you is that when I get something wrong, I'll tell you directly and I'll fix it directly. That's the only version of this job I know how to do." The 30 seconds Dana sent ended there. Ryan watched it twice. Then he set his phone down and thought about Ellen Park saying, "That's the only version of this job I know how to do," and felt something move in his chest that was closer to hope than anything he'd felt in a long time about a large institution. Victoria called in the 3rd week of January. He had wondered, actually, whether she would. He had thought she might. There had been something in that last look across the conference room table, something unresolved and real, and he had learned over time that people who carried genuinely unresolved things tended to eventually come back to them. But he hadn't been certain. Victoria Langley's pride was a real thing, not a character flaw exactly, but a load-bearing wall in how she understood herself, and dismantling even a portion of it to make a phone call like this would have required something significant. Apparently, the 10 weeks since November had been sufficient. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. He was at his daughter's school. A different kind of Wednesday afternoon, the kind where Lily had a parent-teacher conference and Ryan had been sitting in a child-sized chair across a child-sized table from her 2nd-grade teacher, who had been telling him that Lily was doing extremely well academically and socially, that she was kind to the other kids, that she had a quality in small group settings of making sure everyone got a turn that the teacher found genuinely unusual in a 7-year-old. He had been sitting in that small chair listening to this and feeling something expand in his chest in the specific way. Good news about your child moves through you when you've been worrying without fully acknowledging that you've been worrying. He stepped out to take the call when he saw Victoria's name on the screen. He stood in the hallway of an elementary school with a bulletin board of snowflake art behind him and answered it. Victoria. Ryan. A pause. Not a strategic one, he could tell the difference. A genuine one. I don't have an agenda for this call. I want to say that first. Okay? I've been thinking about what you said in the conference room and what you said before that at the all hands. Another pause. You were right. That's not easy for me to say, so I'm going to say it directly and not dress it up. You were right. He leaned against the wall beside the snowflake bulletin board. What specifically? About the results. About what the results should have told me. You'd built things that worked. The documentation was there. The performance record was there. Her voice had a flat, careful quality, like someone reading from a script they'd written to make themselves say things they didn't want to say. I didn't see it because I wasn't looking at you. I was looking at what I already believed about who you were, and those were two different things. Ryan thought for a moment before responding. Can I ask you something honestly? Yes. What did you believe about who I was? She took a breath. I believed you were competent, she said. Good at the technical side of things. A worker, not a leader. Someone who would always be more useful below than above. The words came out measured, not defensive, which told him she had been sitting with them for a while. I also believed, and this is harder to say, that you weren't ambitious, that you didn't have the drive that leadership requires, and I equated that with a kind of limitation. Whereas, Ryan said, whereas what you actually were was someone who didn't need the title to do the work, which is, I've been thinking about this a lot. That's actually the opposite of a limitation. That's a kind of freedom I don't think I have. A pause. I don't think I've ever done anything important without needing someone to see me do it. The honesty of this sat in the elementary school hallway between them, strange and unexpectedly large. That's not the worst thing in the world to recognize, Ryan said carefully. It's not a small thing to recognize either. No, he said, it isn't. A longer pause. From somewhere down the hall, he could hear a class changing periods, the managed chaos of children moving between rooms. He thought about Lily in there, somewhere, learning to make sure everyone got a turn. I owe you an apology, Victoria said. A real one, not a strategic one. Okay. What I said at the all hands, about knowing your place in front of 400 people. Her voice had tightened slightly, and he understood what that tightening cost her. That was wrong. Not just an outcome. It was wrong in the way it treated you as a person, and I'm sorry. Ryan was quiet for a moment, not making her wait, genuinely taking the time to receive what she had said, to let it be what it was, rather than something to process quickly and move past. I accept that, he said. That's all? What else should there be? She seemed momentarily uncertain, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. I don't know. Most people, if the situation were reversed, I think I'd want to say more, ask for more. I didn't do any of this to get something from you, Victoria. I never wanted that. I wanted the company to function correctly and the people in it to be treated fairly. Both of those things are happening now. He paused. Your apology is real, and I'm receiving it as real. That's not a small thing. That's actually what I wanted. Another silence. When she spoke again, some of the tightness had left her voice. Not all of it, but some. I'm at a consulting firm now, much smaller, 12 people. I know, I heard. I'm trying to do it differently, make decisions differently, see people differently. A short, dry sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It's harder than I expected, seeing people. I didn't realize how much I wasn't doing it. It gets easier, Ryan said. If you actually want to do it, it gets easier. How do you know? Because I'm not naturally patient, he said, and I'm not naturally trusting. Those are things I've had to learn and relearn. The wanting is the hard part. The practice gets easier. She was quiet for a moment, then, thank you for taking the call. Thank you for making it, he said. They said goodbye without any resolution that felt like an ending, because it wasn't one. It was more like a door that had been forced open that would need to be walked through multiple times before anyone knew what was on the other side. That was honest. That was the actual shape of it. He went back into the classroom and folded himself back into the small chair and listened to Lily's teacher tell him about his daughter's capacity for fairness. The following Saturday, for the first time since October, Ryan did not have a task list. He recognized this fact mid-morning while standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee and realized that the absence of forward-facing urgency felt genuinely disorienting, the way it always feels when you've been running hard towards something and you arrive and the forward motion stops, and you have to remember what it was like to simply stand somewhere. Lily came in from the hallway with Mr. Trunks and climbed onto the kitchen stool and looked at him with the casual assessment of someone who had been monitoring his stress levels for months. "You look different again," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. Like the important thing is done. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, sharp as a tack and entirely uninterested in being managed, and perceptive in the specific devastating way of children who have learned to read adults carefully because circumstances made it necessary. He had never wanted that for her. He had tried, these 3 years, to give her as much ordinary childhood as a single father with a complicated situation could provide. Pasta dinners, and go fish, and Mr. Trunks, and bath time submarines. The ordinary things that made up the actual fabric of a life, as opposed to the significant things that got remembered. He didn't know how much she had absorbed anyway, just by being nearby. He suspected more than he wanted. But she was okay. She was by every measure available to him, okay. "The important thing is done," he said. She nodded with satisfaction, the way she nodded when a math problem resolved correctly. "Can we go to the park?" "It's 38 degrees. "I know." "You want to go to the park in 38 degrees?" "Mr. Trunks wants fresh air," she said. He looked at her, at the complete earnestness of this position, and felt something shift in his chest into a shape that was lighter than anything he'd carried in a long time. "Get your coat," he said. She slid off the stool and disappeared down the hallway, and he could hear the specific series of sounds that meant she was locating her coat and boots, and probably Mr. Trunks's scarf, a small knitted item she had produced at some point from unknown materials and that he had never questioned. He put on his own jacket. He checked his pockets out of habit, keys, phone, wallet. His phone had a message from Dana. The 9th floor actually had a functioning project review meeting today, with, actual feedback. Ellen ran it herself. And then, "I thought you should know." He replied, "That's good." Then, after a moment, "Really good." Lily reappeared wearing her coat and boots and carrying Mr. Trunks, who was indeed wearing his scarf. "Ready," she announced. "Let's go," Ryan said. They went to the park in 38-degree weather, and it was cold and mostly empty, and the bare trees had a particular stark quality against the gray-white sky. And Lily ran across the grass toward the swings without any apparent awareness of or concern for the temperature. And Ryan followed her and pushed her when she asked to be pushed, and stood with his hands in his pockets the rest of the time, watching her swing and listening to her commentary on the wind and the sky, and Mr. Trunks's opinion of the cold. It was not a remarkable afternoon. It was very ordinary. The kind of afternoon that makes up most of a life, and that people tend to remember later, when they are older and looking back, as the thing they were actually doing while they thought they were building towards something. Ryan Ashford stood in a cold Chicago park and watched his daughter swing and understood, without needing it to be larger than it was, that he was already inside the thing he had been building toward. The cold broke in late February. Not all at once. Chicago didn't work that way, didn't do anything so clean or decisive as a single weather shift. It came in degrees, the way most real change comes, one slightly less brutal morning at a time, until one Tuesday in the 3rd week of February. Ryan walked Lily to school and realized halfway there that he had forgotten his scarf and wasn't going back for it. And that was fine. And that was how he knew the worst of winter was done. A year had passed since the board meeting. Roughly. He wasn't counting in any formal sense, but the body keeps its own calendar, and his body knew. Lily was 8 now. She had turned 8 in December, at a birthday party Ryan had organized in the living room of their apartment with 6 other 8-year-olds and a sheet cake from the bakery on the corner, and a craft project involving felt and googly eyes that had gone significantly more chaotic than the instructions had suggested. He had cleaned up glitter from the kitchen floor for 4 days afterward. Lily had declared it the best party she'd ever had, and since she'd had 8 of them and he'd organized 7, he received this assessment with appropriate humility. Mr. Trunks was still operational. Slightly more weathered around the ears than a year ago, one of the original button eyes replaced with a slightly larger brown one after a laundering incident that Ryan still thought about with residual guilt, but still present, still consulted, still apparently in possession of strong opinions about cold weather and bath time and the quality of various pasta sauces. The ordinary things. They accumulated without announcement, without ceremony, and became the texture of a life. Novacore Technologies, 1 year after Ellen Park had stood at a podium in the 12th floor atrium and told 400 people she would make mistakes and fix them honestly, looked genuinely different from the inside. Not perfect. Ryan had no illusions about perfect and no particular use for the concept. Ellen had made mistakes, as promised. She'd reorganized the Eastern Division reporting structure in March, in a way that created 3 months of coordination problems before she acknowledged the structure wasn't working and reversed it. And she'd hired a VP of operations in April who turned out to be a better interviewer than a manager and had to be managed out by September in a process that was handled correctly but still cost real time and real organizational energy. These were the kinds of errors that institutions make when they're being run by people who are genuinely trying rather than performing competence. And they were, in Ryan's view, acceptable errors. The kind you could recover from and learn from, as opposed to the kind that eroded the foundations over time without anyone acknowledging it. What had changed, and changed in ways that showed up in measurable terms? The 3-year attrition rate in the mid-level project divisions had dropped by 41%. The anonymous employee satisfaction surveys Ellen had implemented quarterly showed a consistent upward trend across every category the audit had flagged as problematic. The Hendricks account had stabilized. Martin Hendricks, who had been on the verge of pulling $4.7 million out of Novacore in the weeks after the Bridger appointment, had not only stayed but expanded the relationship after 2 conversations with Ellen in which she had listened more than she spoke and had followed through on the specific things she said she would follow through on within the specific time frames she had named. He told Dana, who told Ryan, that it was the first time in 2 years he felt like the company actually understood what his firm needed. Dana herself had been promoted in September to Director of Project Operations, a role that had been effectively hers for 2 years without the title or the compensation. Ellen had told her, in the conversation where she offered the role, that the promotion was 4 years overdue and that she was sorry it had taken this long. Dana had told Ryan this on the phone that evening, in a voice that was trying very hard to be matter-of-fact and was not entirely succeeding. She said it was overdue, Dana said. Just like that. No spin on it. What did you say? I said thank you. Then I went back to my desk and stared at my computer for about 10 minutes. That seems right, Ryan said. Ryan. A pause. Is this what it's supposed to feel like, being seen for what you actually do? He thought about the question, the real weight of it, what it was asking under the surface. I think so, he said. Yeah, I think that's exactly what it's supposed to feel like. She was quiet for a moment. It's strange. I've been working for 15 years and this is the first time a promotion didn't feel like a transaction. Hold on to that, he said. It matters more than it sounds. Ryan's formal relationship with Novacore had evolved into something that existed on no org chart, but functioned with a clarity that both parties understood. The Friday calls with Ellen had continued through the first 6 months and had gradually become less frequent as Ellen found her footing, monthly by the fall, and by January she had called twice without a scheduled agenda, once to run something by him, and once, he suspected, just to have a conversation with someone who understood the full context of what she was navigating. He had also, in February of the previous year, begun an informal advisory arrangement with a small nonprofit that worked on workforce development in underfunded Chicago neighborhoods. Not paid, not formal, just a twice-monthly commitment to meet with their operations director and work through whatever organizational challenges needed working through. It was the kind of work that didn't appear on any resume or any investor profile, and he had not told anyone he was doing it except Dana and Lily, who had been informed because she needed to understand why certain Saturday mornings were spoken for. Is it important? She had asked. Yeah, he said. It is. More important than the park? Different important than the park. She had weighed this with the seriousness she applied to resource allocation questions. Okay, she had decided, but sometimes the park too. Sometimes the park too, he agreed. It was, he had found, a manageable life. Not a simple one. He had never expected simple and would not have trusted it if it arrived. But manageable in the sense that the different weights of it were distributed across a structure that could hold them. And on the days when one thing was heavier than expected, he had enough practice with the load to compensate. He thought sometimes about what he would have said 3 years earlier if someone had told him what the next 3 years would contain. He probably would have believed most of it, the hard parts, the exhausting parts, the parts that required him to hold things quietly for longer than felt reasonable. He would have had a harder time believing the part where he was sitting in his kitchen on a February morning, unhurried, with good coffee and a daughter who was currently in her room engaged in some elaborate imaginative scenario involving Mr. Trunks, and what sounded like a court proceeding. He was listening to the court proceeding through the wall. Mr. Trunks appeared to be the defendant. The charges were unclear, but apparently serious. Icha. The call from a journalist came in March. Not a major outlet. A business and culture magazine that had been covering the Novacor governance story in pieces over the past year, primarily through the public audit summary and Ellen Park's public statements about the company's restructuring. The journalist was named Marcus Webb, and he had done his research, which Ryan respected, and he had somehow obtained enough background information to know that the anonymous shareholder at the center of the governance review was Ryan Ashford, which Ryan had been prepared for eventually, and which had arrived approximately 2 months earlier than he'd expected. Marcus Webb called on a Wednesday morning. He was professional and direct, and made no attempt to obscure what he was looking for. "I want to understand the full story," he said. "From your side. The 3 years inside the company, the decision to come forward, what you were actually trying to accomplish. I think the public version of this story has been missing the most important part." "What do you think the most important part is?" Ryan asked. "You," Marcus said. "Why someone with your position does what you did the way you did it. No self-promotion, no public credit. You handed the CEO role to someone else and walked away. In my experience covering business, that doesn't happen. So I want to understand what kind of person does that, and why." Ryan held his phone and looked out his kitchen window at the February sky doing its gradual winter relenting thing. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's not a no," Marcus said. "It's not a no," Ryan confirmed. He thought about it for 4 days. "I thought about what the story would look like in print, how it would be received, what it would do to the quiet he had managed to build around himself and Lily over the past year. He thought about whether telling it served anything beyond the telling of it. He called Dana. "The journalist from the magazine called," he said. "I know," she said. "He called me too. I didn't tell him anything." "I know you didn't." He paused. "What do you think I should do?" She was quiet for a moment, which meant she had already thought about this and was deciding how to frame it. "I think," she said slowly, "that there are people in that building, not just Novacor, companies like Novacor, companies that still work the way Novacor used to work. And they're sitting at desks exactly like the one you sat at, doing exactly what you did and being told exactly what you were told. And they don't know it's possible for it to turn out differently." He didn't say anything. "That's what the story is," Dana said. "Not you, that." He called Marcus Webb back the following morning. "I'll talk to you," he said. "One conversation. I control what's on the record, and the story isn't about me." "What is it about?" Marcus asked. "What happens to a company when the people running it mistake quiet for weakness?" A brief pause. "That's the headline," Marcus said. "That's the point," Ryan said. "Well, the piece ran in April. It was longer than Ryan had expected and more careful than he had feared. Marcus Webb had, in fact, understood what the story was and had told it in a way that centered the structural failure rather than the dramatic arc, which was harder to write and more accurate. It included interviews with Dana, with 2 of the division-level employees who had submitted transfer requests and who had since returned to the company under Ellen's leadership, and with Patricia Reyes from the board. It did not include an interview with Victoria Langley, who had declined through a representative. Ryan read it at his kitchen table early on a Thursday morning before Lily was awake, with coffee and the specific composure of someone reading about events they lived through and finding that the written version makes them feel farther away rather than closer. He had lived all of it. Seeing it laid out in someone else's sentences was a strange experience, like looking at a photograph of a room you know very well and finding it both accurate and somehow wrong about what it felt like to be inside it. The response to the article was more than he anticipated. Not viral. He was not a figure the general public had any reason to know, but specific and substantive in ways that arrived in his inbox over the following 2 weeks, and that he read carefully because they deserved to be read carefully. People wrote to him through this magazine's contact form because his own contact information was not public, and Marcus Webb forwarded the messages that he thought were worth forwarding. A project manager in Atlanta who had been passed over for a promotion 3 times and was about to quit. A woman in Phoenix who had spent 5 years documenting the same patterns he had documented and had not known what to do with the documentation. A man in his 60s who had retired from a company that had treated him exactly this way and who wanted Ryan to know, simply, that he was glad someone had finally said it out loud. Ryan read each of them. He answered the ones that asked questions he could honestly answer. He did not answer the ones that asked him to consult on their specific situation, not because he didn't care, but because he understood the limits of what he could actually do at a distance with incomplete information, and pretending otherwise would have been a kindness that wasn't kind. One message he read 3 times. It was from a woman named Carol, 58 years old, a mid-level operations manager at a company in Columbus, Ohio. She wrote that she had been invisible at her company for 11 years. Not badly treated, she was careful about this distinction, and he respected the care, just invisible. Her work was done and done well and attributed, when it was attributed at all, to the general functioning of a department rather than to the specific effort of a specific person. She had gotten to the point, she wrote, where she had begun to wonder whether the invisibility was a fact about her rather than a fact about the system. She wrote, "Reading about you didn't make me feel like I should do what you did. I don't have a family trust. I don't have leverage. I'm not in a position to call an emergency board meeting. But reading about you made me feel like I was right, all along, that the work was real and that what was wrong was the system, and not me. I haven't felt that in years, so I just wanted to say thank you for making it true somewhere, even if only somewhere." He sat with that message for a long time. Then he wrote back. He wrote that she was right, and that the work was real, and that the system being broken was a fact about the system and not a fact about her, and that he was sorry it had taken 11 years for someone to say it in a way that reached her. He wrote that he didn't have a clean answer for what she should do with that information. That was the honest thing. But that knowing the difference between what was real and what the system told her was real was the first thing, and not a small thing. He pressed send and closed the laptop and sat in his kitchen with his cold coffee and felt the full, unglamorous weight of what it meant that that message needed to be written at all. That there were thousands of Carols, tens of thousands probably, doing real work in systems that had decided they were invisible. He couldn't fix that. He knew he couldn't fix that. One board meeting, one governance audit, one company restructured in Chicago did not fix that. But it was true that it was wrong. And he had made it true in at least one place that it could be otherwise. That was not nothing. He had spent enough time in rooms that told people their work was nothing to understand that not nothing was, in fact, a great deal. Lily asked him about the article in the way 8-year-olds ask about things, obliquely, from a different angle than expected, while they were doing something else entirely. They were making dinner. Ryan was at the stove and Lily was supposedly setting the table, a task she performed with a highly personal interpretation of what constituted complete, which generally involved Mr. Trunks receiving a place setting. "Mia's mom showed her the article about you," she said, from the direction of the table. Mia was her best friend at school. Ryan processed this information with the particular parental alertness of someone calibrating how much his child knew about something he had not fully explained. "What did Mia say?" he asked. "She said you were famous." "I'm not famous." "That's what I told her." A pause, during which the specific sound of Mr. Trunks being positioned at the table occurred. "She said you had a lot of money, and you pretended not to." Ryan stirred the pasta. "I didn't pretend. I just didn't talk about it." Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone assembling a more complete picture from previously separate pieces of information. He recognized this expression. It appeared sometimes when she had been thinking about something for longer than she'd let on. "Is that why you went to that job?" she said. "Even though you didn't have to?" He turned the heat down and looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's part of why." "What's the other part?" He thought about how to answer this honestly, at a level that was true without being more than she needed. He thought about the Carols and the Amara, who had left for a competitor and was thriving, and the 6-year veteran with the transfer request, and the junior analyst with the overlooked ideas. Because there were people there who needed things to be fairer, he said, and I was in a position to help make them fairer. And not doing it when you're in that position is its own kind of choice. She thought about this with the seriousness she applied to moral questions, which was the same seriousness she applied to math problems and elephant jurisprudence. Like when you can reach something on the high shelf and someone else can't, she said. He looked at his daughter. Exactly like that, he said. She went back to the table, apparently satisfied. He heard her explain the situation to Mr. Trunks in a low, informative voice. In May, Ryan received an unexpected phone call from Gerald Holt. Not about company business. The formal shareholder relationship continued through the trust's legal representation. And Gerald and Ryan had developed over the course of the previous year the kind of relationship that exists between two people who have been through something significant together and have arrived on the other side with a mutual, unspoken respect. They had lunch twice. They talked sometimes about things unrelated to Novacor, Gerald's grandchildren, Ryan's thoughts on the city's development projects, the particular difficulty of understanding anything about the younger generations without condescending to them. Gerald called on a Tuesday afternoon and got to the point in the way he always got to the point. I have something I want to put to you, he said, and I want you to hear it fully before you answer. Okay. I'm on the advisory council for a business school program, executive leadership development, targeted at mid-career professionals, people who are good at their work and being considered for senior roles. The program has a gap. They teach strategy and finance and negotiation and all the usual things, but they don't teach anyone how to see people, how to actually read an organization at the human level, which is where most leadership failures originate. A pause. I told them about you. Not everything, but enough. They want to know if you'd be willing to participate, not as a lecturer, not in any formal academic capacity, more as a practitioner who could talk to cohorts of students about what organizational culture actually looks like from inside it. Ryan was quiet for a moment. What would that involve practically? He asked. 2 or 3 sessions per cohort, a few hours each. You'd talk about what you observed, how you thought about it, what you did, and why. They'd push back, ask questions. You wouldn't be teaching theory. You'd be teaching from what you actually know. He thought about Marcus Webb's article and the responses it had generated. He thought about Carol in Columbus. He thought about what Dana had said about people sitting at desks not knowing it could turn out differently. Let me think about it, he said. Take your time, Gerald said. But Ryan, you figured out something about how organizations actually work that most people with business degrees never figure out. That's worth sharing. It's worth sharing if it actually helps people, Ryan said. I'll think about what that would mean in practice. That's all I'm asking. He said yes 2 weeks later, after talking it through with Dana, who said immediately and without hesitation that he had to do it, and with Lily, who asked whether it meant he would be a teacher now. And when he explained that it was more like occasional talks to adults, she said that adults were harder than kids because adults thought they already knew things. He had found this observation difficult to dispute. The first session was in September. 18 mid-career professionals in a room at a business school on the north side of the city, ranging in age from early 30s to early 50s, all of them sharp enough to have been identified for leadership development, and all of them carrying the specific kind of professional intelligence that had been trained to look at organizations in particular ways. He talked for about 40 minutes, and then opened the room for questions, which was where it got genuinely interesting. A woman in her late 30s named Priya, who worked in healthcare administration, asked him how he had sustained the patients for 3 years without it becoming resentment. He thought about this honestly. It did become resentment sometimes, he said. I'd be dishonest if I said it didn't. There were nights where I went home angry, where I thought about walking out, where I wondered whether what I was doing was naive or pointless or just an elaborate way of hurting myself slowly. He paused. What kept it from becoming permanent resentment was that I kept the focus on what I was trying to accomplish, rather than on what was being done to me. Those are 2 different focuses, and they lead to very different states. He looked at her. That's not a natural thing for most people. It was hard for me. I had to choose it consciously, regularly, and sometimes I didn't manage it. A man in his mid-40s named Derek, who worked in financial services, Asked him whether he thought what he had done required a specific kind of personality. Implied in the question was whether it was replicable for people who were not, as Derek put it, built that way. I wasn't born patient, Ryan said. I wasn't born strategic. I was raised by a man who worked construction and who polished his boots every morning as a discipline, not as a feeling. A lot of what I did came from understanding that you do the right thing as a practice, not as a mood. The mood follows the practice, not the other way around. He looked at Derek. What you're actually asking is whether integrity is a character trait or a skill. I think it's both. The trait inclines you toward it. The skill is what you build when the inclination runs out. A question came from the back of the room, from a quiet man who had not spoken yet. He was older than most of the cohort, perhaps early 50s, with the look of someone who had spent a long career in organizations and who was in the room because he was trying to understand something rather than advance somewhere. Did you ever think about whether it was worth it? He asked. Not strategically, personally. Did you ever sit with the question of whether what it cost you, the time, the years, being invisible on purpose, was actually worth what came out of it? The room was very quiet. Ryan took the question seriously, the way it deserved. Yes, he said. I think about it still. Not with regret. I want to be clear about that. But I think about the cost honestly, because I think you have to. You have to be honest about what you gave up to do something a certain way, or you're not actually evaluating it, you're just narrating it. He paused. What I know is this. If I had done it differently, if I had leveraged my position earlier, if I had made it about my advancement, if I had let the anger run the timeline instead of the evidence, the outcome would have looked similar from the outside. Victoria would still have been removed, the company would still have restructured, but the people inside that company would have experienced a power struggle, not a reckoning, and a power struggle teaches people that what matters is who wins. A reckoning, when it's done honestly, teaches people that what matters is what's true. He looked at the man in the back. I needed it to be a reckoning, for it to mean anything, so that's what it cost. The man in the back nodded slowly. He didn't ask a follow-up question, and Ryan understood that he hadn't needed one answered. He drove home from that first session through September Chicago, the city doing its brief annual performance of something resembling grace before fall settled in properly. The light at that particular angle, the trees with their color beginning to turn at the edges, the streets not yet buried under the gray that would come in November and stay until February's slow relenting. He was tired in a way that felt useful rather than depleting. The difference between those two kinds of tired was something he had learned to distinguish only recently, and the learning had been gradual enough that he wasn't sure when exactly it had happened. He picked up Lily from the after-school program at 5:15. She came out with her backpack and her coat half-zipped and Mr. Trunks tucked under one arm, and she climbed into the car and looked at him with the assessment she had developed over a year of monitoring his states. "How was the teaching thing?" she asked. "Good," he said. "It was actually good." "Did the adults think they already knew everything?" "Some of them," he said, "but the ones who didn't were worth it." She nodded, satisfied. "Are we having pasta?" He pulled out of the parking lot. "What do you think?" "I think yes," she said. "Then yes," he said. They drove home through the September light, and the city moved around them with its usual indifference to any individual story inside it. And that was fine. That was the correct relationship between a city and the people living their lives inside it. The city didn't need to know. The people who needed to know knew. 1 year becomes 2 in the way that time moves when you stop counting it urgently. Not quickly exactly, but without the friction of anticipation. Ryan Ashford remained at 33 and then at 34 exactly who he had been. A single father, a shareholder in a company that was now being run the way it should have been run from the beginning. An occasional presence in a business school seminar room. A man who polished his shoes every morning and made pasta twice a week and lost at Go Fish with a consistency that had stopped being a surprise to anyone. He was not famous. The article had brought a temporary visibility that faded in the way temporary visibility always fades, which was the correct outcome. He did not need to be known by people who hadn't been in the rooms where the actual things had happened. The rooms where the actual things had happened. The atrium on the 12th floor, the conference room on the 41st floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue, the small room down the hall where he had waited with cold coffee for an hour and 20 minutes while his father's briefcase sat beside his chair, Those rooms he carried with him in the specific way you carry the places where you found out what you were made of. Not as trophies, more like benchmarks. The knowledge that you had been tested at a certain weight and had held. He thought sometimes about what he would tell a younger version of himself, if such a thing were possible. Not the 14-year-old watching a man take credit for 3 other men's work. The 30-year-old who had walked into a company with a worn leather folder and 3 years of quiet ahead of him. He thought he would say, "It takes longer than you think. The patience is real, not a strategy. The people you're trying to help won't always know that's what you're doing, and that's correct. That's how it should be. You will be angry sometimes and tired most of the time. And there will be nights when you question whether the way you're choosing to do this is naivety dressed as principle. On those nights, polish your shoes and go to sleep. It is not naivety. It is the slower, less satisfying, more durable version of the thing most people try to accomplish quickly." He would also say, "Your daughter will be okay. She will ask you hard questions with the directness of someone who deserves real answers, and you will give them as honestly as you can, and that will be enough. Not perfect. Enough." He would say, "The work is the thing, not the recognition of the work, not the authority to do more work, not the position from which the work becomes visible. The work itself. Find the broken thing and fix it. Document what you see. Stay until staying means something, and leave when it doesn't. The rest arranges itself around those choices in ways you cannot predict and do not need to." He didn't say any of this to anyone because the 30-year-old version of himself didn't exist to say it to. He said some version of it to the cohorts in the business school seminar room when it fit. He said parts of it to Lily, in language appropriate to an 8-year-old who was building her own understanding of how the world worked and what it required of you. She was building a good one. He could see it in the way she moved through her days. The fairness that her teacher had mentioned, the attention to whether everyone had gotten a turn. She had not learned that from a lesson. She had absorbed it from the air of a home where the person doing the raising believed it, practiced it, and on the days when the belief was difficult to sustain, went through the motions of the practice until the belief caught back up. That was the inheritance he was leaving her, not the trust, not the stake in a restructured company, not the article in a business magazine. The understanding that quiet was not weakness, that patience was not passivity, that the measure of a person was not what they claimed for themselves, but what they built, what they fixed, and how they treated the people in the rooms where no one they were trying to impress was watching. He pulled the pasta from the cabinet. He put the water on to boil. From down the hall, he could hear Lily in her room, narrating something to Mr. Trunks in the low, serious voice she used when the scenario was important. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was decisive. Mr. Trunks was apparently receiving a verdict of some kind. The water began to heat. Outside the kitchen window, Chicago was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people carrying things no one else could see. Full of Carols and Amaras and junior analysts with overlooked ideas. Full of systems that needed work, and people with the capacity to do the work, and the gap between them that was the oldest problem in any organization built by human beings, which was to say every organization that had ever existed. The gap didn't close all at once. It closed the way the cold broke in February. In degrees, one slightly better morning at a time, until the day you walked outside without your scarf and realized the worst of it was behind you. Ryan Ashford stood at his stove and waited for the water to boil and listened to his daughter deliver her verdict to a stuffed elephant in the next room. And the city moved outside his window, and the ordinary evening assembled itself around him in all its unremarkable weight, and he held it without trying to make it more than it was. It was enough. It had always been enough. He had just needed to build the kind of life where he could finally feel that it was.